Spoilers for a nearly 20-year-old game. I don't know why you'd be watching this video to begin with if you haven't already played BioShock or at least know the gist of it, but there you go. BioShock is a classic for good reason. The timeless Art Deco design, the frankly insane premise of a city under the sea, and fighting spliced up drug addicts while classic tunes are bopping in the background, what's not to love? It's a great example of how good art direction frankly transcends its time and place, and if you played it, I'd wager the flooded corridors of Rapture, the gardens of Arcadia, or Sander Cohen's vaudevillian displays in Fraught Frolic come to mind far more than the million ray-traced DLSS slop being released today. Of course, that's not what BioShock is truly remembered for, because much like System Shock 2 before it, these are narrative shooters, often called FPS RPG hybrids, even though the RPG elements are very minimal, that lives and dies by its story. A man chooses, a slave obeys. I won't get too far into the whole philosophical undertones that Levine and Irrational Games were attempting to critique in BioShock, but the short of it was a kind of laissez-faire capitalism as proposed by the modernist thinker Ayn Rand. This was hilariously dubbed objectivism, which should give you an idea of just how full of it she was, but Rand was a staunch believer in market forces and the idea that meritocracy and the spirit of the common man and creative genius would rise up and take its place in a new, free-thinking utopia. One look at Rapture, albeit taken to its extreme, should give you an idea of what happens when capitalism and idealistic principles are given complete free rein, with no moral, ethical, or even legal restraints to keep them in check. The political angle of BioShock is a whole other discussion entirely, but what's really worth focusing on here is the idea of free will. By now, everyone knows the phrase, "would you kindly," and the twist that Jack, the protagonist of BioShock, was essentially a brainwashed sleeper agent from birth, the bastard child of Andrew Ryan, whose arch-nemesis Frank Fontaine stole and then used to plot his downfall. I'm hardly the first person to point this out, because there's the literal interpretation of course, but where BioShock really gets interesting is in what it has to say about player agency and the manipulative nature of game design. In this reading, "would you kindly" is not just a code word by Atlas to get Jack, the character in World, to follow his commands, but also you, the player, to follow the path that has been set out by the developers, just as with Fontaine. This culminates in the famous reveal in Ryan's office that he knows you're just a brainless pawn that's been used by Atlas all along, and you're little more than a dog, taught to roll over on command. Not a man, but a slave. The antithesis, the Antichrist if you want to be dramatic, to his dream of rapture and freedom from the sickness of the world above. Here's the problem though, the game just keeps on going. Let's take it back a bit first. BioShock's meta-commentary here is that just as how the yellow paint being slapped on every graphical powerhouse today because the developers can't be bothered to diegetically lead the player through good level design or lighting, you are following a pre-described route by the developers as much as Fontaine. The big, stupid arrow at the top of the screen wasn't Irrational's choice. From memory, Ken Levine said at some point it was mandated by the publisher 2K, thinking the lowest common denominator was too stupid to navigate maps that weren't even that big by the standards of the time. The code phrase, "would you kindly," is made pretty clear from the start, and Atlas, the poor working Irishman that Fontaine used as a cover after faking his death, is directing you right up until the reveal. As Jack, your whole life is an illusion. You were stolen away from your mother in Rapture and treated as little more than a sack of meat, test tube, that would serve its purpose for Fontaine. The plane crash, Ryan's death, all this was essentially preordained, and you never had a choice to begin with. When Tenenbaum intervenes and begins to undo some of his conditioning, however, the game just keeps going. You have essentially traded one master for another. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand it would have been stupid as hell for Jack to just keel over and die, or roll credits, but when BioShock poses the question of free will and railing against the intended path of game design, that that as both a character and a player, you have little agency. Why do we just continue to do what others want after this point? This is also a bit of a rehash of System Shock 2, given what happened with Polito and the reveal of who you've actually been talking to on comms this whole time, but that's another story. To be honest, there's a bigger discussion about Bioshock dropping off around the third act in general, but to return to Andrew Ryan's central thematic question, you still haven't really chosen, have you? You are still not a man, because all you do from this point on is obey. The fact all this culminates in a happy-go-lucky ending for most players because of how easy it is to get, again, another thing that was forced by the publisher since Irrational wanted to make the resource economy harder, still doesn't really address the very questions that Bioshock raises. At what point does Jack, do you, ever really choose? You'll always end up fighting that goofy-looking final boss that's deliberately evocative of Fountainhead. Hell, if anything, the third act makes it worse by putting you through a kind of self-inflicted lobotomy through turning you into one of those big lovable bastards.
Look, Mr. Bubbles, it's an angel.
God damn, I love these big guys. Then you're told in a cutscene, once all this is over, about the kind of person that Jack became, but that was mostly separate from your actions as a player, wasn't it? Either you harvested the Little Sisters or you didn't. That's all that really mattered. But to you, to Jack, you were always a pawn. For Atlas, for Fontaine, for Andrew Ryan, for Suchong, for Tenenbaum, and then it's over. This might sound a little harsh. To be clear, I still love Bioshock. I think it's a fun shooter. The art direction is obviously timeless, and if anything, gets more beautiful with age, and the story is a challenging discussion around free will and political philosophy that no one would dare to touch with a 10-foot pole today. But if you pose questions around free will, and then you and the character just keep doing what people to tell you to because there's no real choice to begin with, what's the point? What are you trying to say after revealing the question that things just pretty much keep going the same way as they were? Perhaps it would have been better to stop playing entirely, to have never picked up the game at all. Would that have ultimately changed anything? Would that still mean we're the hero? Spec Ops was shovelware trash that no one really expected much to come of it. Clearly 2K didn't either. Funny how we're still with the same publisher, because they handed the IP off to some no-name studio, and that was pretty much that. Like FromSoft and Sony with Demon's Souls before us, however, Yager was handed the opportunity of a lifetime. Minimal publisher interference. They could do almost anything they wanted. All that mattered was turning out some middleware product that would make a bit of money back. What this resulted in was Spec Ops: The Line, and if not the best story in any shooter, certainly the most important. Unlike Bioshock, which expects you to walk its predetermined path and then pretends you've achieved some level of freedom as you continue to do that right up until the end, Spec Ops ever so slowly reveals its hand that, much like Captain Walker, you shouldn't have come here to begin with. All these people would still be alive if you hadn't picked up the controller. If you've never played Spec Ops: The Line, which is unfortunately more likely than not given its commercial failure and subsequent removal from storefronts after some licensing expired, the gist of it is fairly simple. Take Apocalypse Now, or Heart of Darkness if you want to argue the differences, and set it in the ruined city of Dubai. You play as Captain Martin Walker and lead a 3-man squad in an effort to find your old mentor, Conrad. Now, if you've heard anything about this game, much like Bioshock, it's mostly around its twist. I've seen some people claim that the gameplay was deliberately generic, that just as with the story, it was trying to lull you into a false sense of security. Personally, that's a little bit too charitable. Spec Ops isn't a fun game to play, whichever way you cut it, but that's secondary to its central point and story. You're not the hero. You doomed thousands of people. You've massacred unarmed civilians, prisoners of war, and in the most famous scene of the game, bombed a civilian camp with white phosphorus artillery. What is quite possibly the most horrific, painful way to die and considered a war crime under the Geneva Convention. But then, it's just easy to lock it away, isn't it? Like Captain Walker, the ends justify the means, don't they? Pick yourself up and keep going. Keep killing. Why did you even come here? Do you even remember? Why Spec Ops: The Line succeeds where BioShock failed is for a multitude of reasons. One, that its release at the height of the 50 Shades of Brown military shooter craze was something it could use to its advantage. Two, the fact you're doomed the moment you take 1 foot into the ruins of Dubai. And three, because you, the player, have the option to stop playing at any time. And yes, like Walker, you can't stop yourself. What people fail to understand when they criticize Spec Ops: The Line is that you're not being pigeonholed or forced into anything. No one forced you to execute civilians. You can sit there for as long as you like and look at Walker's face reflected in the screen before you fire the white phosphorus, because in coming here at all, you have already taken a step down the path of damnation. The positioning of the American military as heroes and either varying shades of brown and or Arabic-speaking people as the terrorist strawman is something the game turns on its head. You're killing just as many American soldiers. Why? You're killing civilians, CIA, and all you were supposed to do was simple: make contact and attempt to rescue survivors. No one asked you to keep going. No one asked you to fire a single shot, but you did. Didn't you? You could have stopped at any time. You could have turned and walked away, just like Captain Walker, but you didn't, did you? This is where the meta-commentary succeeds, when compared to all the other games before it, Hotline Miami, BioShock, that failed. Walker destroys himself, his squad, the entire city, and it's all on you. Conrad was dead long before you ever arrived. Sure, Spec Ops isn't all perfect. I do agree that Captain Walker talking to himself on the walkie-talkie you find early on, and Lugo and Adams not saying anything about it is a bit of a stretch, but there is agency in a story and game like this, whereas BioShock breaks with its own narrative and point it's attempting to say. What Yager were able to achieve with a game no one expected anything of, 2K had written off for little more than tax purposes and holding on to a mostly dead IP, is remarkable. I could talk about this game all day, but Spec Ops: The Line was lightning in a bottle for an industry that had become so saturated with the chest-thumping, big-dick, revisionist slop of pro-American and anti-everything else in the military shooters of its day. In saying that, The Line is hardly anti-American either. It's not really pro-anything. It does not condemn war any more than it endorses it. It's humanist. It's empathetic, and slaps you across the face and forces you to sit down and look at the realities of what war does to everyone involved. The soldiers fighting, the civilians scampering for what little food and water is left, the people at the top that are so far removed from the realities of warfare. Like Apocalypse Now before it, Spec Ops: The Line is a thematic, symbolic journey that will make or break anyone who is still left standing at the end. It's a hauntingly beautiful and timeless classic that managed to transcend what everyone was expecting from it, and if you want to see what happens when good writing is paired with an otherwise run-of-the-mill shooter, it doesn't get much better than this. With the influx of indie games over the past 10 years or so, a lot of stories have attempted to follow in the footsteps of Fight Club and other examples of meta-commentary. Hotline Miami is the most obvious example, except it revels in violence, amounting to little more than a nudge and a wink at the camera for what a terrible person someone would have to be to do this in real life. Ruiner, Oxo, or Ocho, however you say it, and a million other games have followed in its footsteps, to the point it's all rather trite and tiresome now. To be clear, you don't have to be some big, grand meta-commentary to be seen as high art or whatever. For the same reason, I don't think everything needs to be hyper-allegorical and overanalyzed to death. As an interactive medium, we owe it to ourselves to ask questions about why players do what they do, what this could mean in a particular context, and maybe bend the rules to explore thematic reasons or the various implications of this. I love BioShock, but would you kindly falls in on itself in much the same way the final stretch of Infinite does. Spec Ops: The Line was frankly the only game to push back against the brainless slaughter of military shooters at the time, even to this day really, and examined violence in a way that doesn't feel like some insincere nagging. The murder hobo is a well-established trope for good reason, and it feels like even now, stories have only just scratched the surface in looking at why you, both as the character and a player, do what you do in a game. It's perfectly fine to turn your brain off and mess around in something anything like Saints Row or GTA, but games can be more. Hopefully, the stories we get will be too.